Howdy, folks, and welcome back to another episode of Follow the Leader. I'm your host, Lee Larson, and joining me from New York this morning, howdy, is Julie Roland. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, man, y'all prepared to be humbled. Listen to this bio. Julie Roland is a former Navy lieutenant commander and helicopter pilot who served for over a decade, including deployments to the South China Sea and the Persian Gulf. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
After service, oh, yeah, a high achieving legal professional, she earned her JD with a 4.0. Okay, whew, all right, let's go, girl. And recently completed a Master of Laws at Columbia University with honors. Now, you are working in New York Assembly's District 73 in Manhattan as the district director. You have a lot of experience in your community too, as a dedicated community leader and advocate. You've held leadership positions in organizations such as the Truman National Security Project. You also have done a number of writing on topics ranging from military policy to children's advocacy in publications. Wow. Thank you so much for, like I said, your service and for continuing to give back to the communities around you. Can you talk about your initial call into the Navy? Was that from family? Was that something else? But what brought you into the Navy, Julie?
Thanks. I think I had a my path to the Navy was not traditional. Let's just say that. I grew up in Berkeley, California. My mom was a poet and a yoga teacher, and by all accounts, a hippie. She dressed up as a peace sign for Halloween when she was 7, and the kids threw eggs at her. But she was also a product of the '60s. She probably would have been a conscientious objector, but she also was fiercely patriotic, just the kind of patriot that thinks patriotism comes with a healthy dose of criticism and skepticism, sometimes a dismantling of a country's systems, but that it's because if you love this house, you want it to be the best house it can be. And so I was raised watching The West Wing, starting when I was about 5 years old, and just had this really idealistic sense of patriotism, and also at a young age developed a passion for leadership and teamwork and just service in general. And so when I was a teenager, I'm in high school, we were living in Baltimore by then. Annapolis was not far away. So the Navy is in my peripheral vision. I did a summer seminar there and they said the magic words. They said leadership, teamwork, service, see the world, and free college, which honestly I think is what gets a lot of people to join the military is the financial, the economic incentives. But I thought, gosh, a lot of the things they're saying, that sounds like me, and I don't know exactly what I wanna do, but I know I care about service and all these other things, and so this seems like a pretty foolproof way to give back to my world, or that's what I thought at 17. So, I applied for ROTC, and that's what I ended up doing is I went to the University of Pennsylvania. The Navy paid for me to do that. I did Reserve Officer Training Corps while I was there, going on active duty every summer and training with the Navy. And then the day I graduated college, I commissioned as an officer. So that's the, long short of it.
Well, I mean, like you said, it's definitely not traditional, but a lot of people, I've talked to so many folks who, families, generations of service, but there's a ton of people who go into the service because it's just kind of different from what they know. And
Yeah.
that element too, like you said, your mom being the hippie out of Berkeley, and again that patriotism, that healthy dose of criticism is a beautiful way to word that. When you served in the South China Sea and you served over in the Persian Gulf, you did get to see the world. What were some of those things that you learned abroad that shaped the way you saw military service and the United States as a state, as a government?
So I did deployments to South China Sea, Persian Gulf, but I'm doing Navy deployments. So most of my time, I'm actually just on a ship in the middle of the ocean. I'm on an aircraft carrier, though I, have done port calls in Singapore and Dubai and Bahrain. And it is interesting pulling into port because when you are seeing the world with 5,000 Americans, which is what happens when we arrive in Dubai, we pull into a port and it's 5,000 Americans descend into a city. It's a unique way to get to know a place. And and it's interesting to see how people respond to a ship like that coming in, just this massive American presence that appears all at once. So that is interesting, and I'm happy to talk about, those moments, but I don't know that they are totally reflective of like what I'm not. It's not a cultural immersion when you arrive by aircraft carrier when you're traveling. But
Yeah.
really, beyond what I learned from being in ports and seeing the world that way, is what I learned being on the ship um, and being in the sky as a helicopter pilot. And so on the ship, what I learned in terms of what the global, what the world looks like, what the global community looks like, is because the ship is full of people from around the world. Yes, the military is American troops, but a lot of people use the military as a path to citizenship. And because
Mm.
it provides an opportunity for upward social mobility, and there are folks joining from often for that reason as a part of it. You get folks who are often from immigrant populations, even within the United States. And so it's just an incredibly diverse place. I don't think that there's almost any job you could ever get out of college where you're going to come face to face with people who have so many different backgrounds in every way, every religion, every part of the United States, but all over the world, using the military as a path to citizenship. So just having all of my perspectives expanded by the conversations with other members of the Navy was one way that I just feel like my entire perspective expanded. And then also you see as you travel, like as you fly, you don't see borders, and oceans blur into oceans, and we have names for all these things on maps. But I think in a lot of ways, flying both over land and over sea, I at least have seen it more as a global community, and seeing the ways in which we don't really stop and start as countries. It's funny when I was watching the Artemis 2 footage and hearing all the feedback from the astronauts, they clearly they're significantly higher in the air than I was getting, but there is a sense of when you see the whole world from above, like when they're looking back at Earth, they're like, we are all one. And it's I can't even imagine what that feels like, but you do get a sense. Even, I mean, I have flown in a helicopter from San Diego to Michigan and, flown up the Mississippi River. But when you start in San Diego, you're starting at the Pacific Ocean, and you watch as the ocean comes to beach, comes to dunes in the desert, and then becomes farmland. You fly up the river, and like seeing just the earth change like that. I think you get a different sense of how connected we all are, which is, I think, an ironic lesson to learn when you're technically in the war business, and
Mhm.
when patriotism theoretically is all about the team spirit of the country you're in within its borders. But actually, I felt I that that my experience in the Navy really expanded me way beyond my borders.
And you're not the first person to go do something like what you did. I read stories about when I was while in seminary. I read stories about pastors and missionaries who would leave the United States during the 1800s, 1900s, and you know go to all these foreign countries and try to evangelize and bring Christianity to all these places. But a lot of missionaries would get there and they saw that these communities already had temples or structures, or they already had systems in place, and it's like almost relativize like uh that missionary trip. And there was a good number of missionaries who returned from these global missionary trips being like, I don't think we actually need to like, I think they're good, like they already have their own systems, like I'm glad they got to know Jesus as like a topic, but and like I but like it's interesting that that effect is you're just not alone in that at all. And I think that's a really beautiful kind of way that the military does show. And also when you hear interviews from folks who have um, advanced through the ranks, particularly officers, they do talk about war and military in a drastically different way than I think a lot of like civilians who haven't served. I see almost like more pro-war, let's go fight rhetoric coming out of folks who maybe haven't served, or just a different. But the further you go up, the less you actually want war. Like you've seen both the destruction and you've also seen the humanity. So
Absolutely. I think people who have been to war are and have had the harrowing experiences of combat are going to be the most important advocates to listen to because they're bringing back that experience and they know that this is not something that should be done lightly, that the toll is so great that both, they see the humanity, sure, and hopefully, but that the toll, on our troops is so great. Like these deployments are painful even when we're not at war. They're long and arduous and you're away from your friends and family and there's a sacrifice even in that. And so it's just I think really understanding like what is at stake and the micro of that of like what it means for every individual who is in that situation, it is felt that much more intimately. And so yeah, it makes sense to me why the veteran voice is hugely important on it and is often, yes, I think exercising more restraint about how the military should be deployed.
Mm, yeah. Well, and talk about your service. We talk about on this channel quite a bit about the intersection of religion and politics and what that looks like, either in history, currently, etc. When you served, did you engage or interact with your chaplains, or what did it look like for your personal faith while you served?
Yeah, I love that question, and it makes sense, coming from you. I did interact with religion while I was serving. I'm Jewish, so being Jewish already made me somewhat of an anomaly. At one point on one of my deployments, I talked to the chaplains on the aircraft carrier, and I asked how many Jews were on board. Did they know? They said they thought there might be two, and 2 out of 5,000 is not. I mean, that's incredibly small. That's smaller than the national. I think that's smaller than the national average. And they said that they knew a chaplain who was a rabbi, but he was not on board. In the end, though, it culminated in me leading a Passover Seder on the aircraft carrier on a deployment. I asked the chaplains if it would be okay if I organized it and I wrote my own prayer book basically for the event and I prepared the food and I set the table. Could I lead a Passover event, like a meal that we call the Seder? And in the end, they helped me market it to the ship and to invite anyone who was curious. And we ended up, it was a beautiful service that I mean, I was basically playing rabbi, but I led the service and the chaplains when they saw it were so impressed with the turnout and how it was that they called the captain up on the walkie-talkie. The captain came down. He was so impressed. He calls the media team. So I have pictures from this. Yeah, otherwise I wouldn't have any pictures, but the media team captured it. But that was an amazing thing to be on deployment, like leading my own
Hmm.
religious service in that way and getting to share that with, commanders of aircraft squadrons and things like that. Um, so that was really cool. But separately, I would go to chaplain services on board if I was free when they were being held. To me, it was really, I was curious. It was an interesting break from the monotony of deployment and what the
Yeah.
normal days might be. And, at a minimum, it's an interesting exercise, almost like taking an English class where we're looking at scripture and then having a discussion about the themes and the morals and values that are in there. And I loved listening to what the sailors had to say. I loved hearing what the chaplain
Mm.
had to say on it. So I had those experiences too. And even in flight school, I actually befriended my chaplain. He played the drums, and when I discovered he played the drums, I would meet with the chaplain and we would jam. And the day that I got my wings of gold, like the day I became a pilot, after, months of jamming with the chaplain and one other pilot who played trumpet and piano, I played guitar. We performed at our winging ceremony. It may have been the first and also last time that there was live music performed by pilots and the chaplain at a winging ceremony, but that was also amazing. We did that in the chapel.
Yeah.
And so anyway, these are just a couple moments that stand out to me. But yes, I think that what they illustrate is that having the chaplains there creates this beautiful break from everything else that you're kind of doing. There's a very regimented, like, tactics forward way that we
Mhm.
approach much of what we do. But because that's there, you get to feel that emotional and spiritual side more. And even if
Yeah.
it's not your religion, like having that outlet just creates space within the confines of the military to, um, fill your cup in other ways. And so I was very grateful. for having that. Um, but I am also, yeah, now I look at as a veteran at what's going on with religion in the military, and it does not reflect what my experience was there.
No, and, first of all, that is amazing to hear about that story and your leadership. Thank you for doing that, and I'm sure your community loved that, and that's really cool that you were celebrated. I am sorry to hear that it came from a problem, though. I mean, and that is the nod of, like, those chaplains maybe should have had a better idea, and, I it's there's a lot there, but I'm glad they wound up celebrating it, and, it did go well, and of course, you should have been celebrated for taking the lead, and that is what leadership does and advocacy, and, so thank you, but yeah,
Well, thanks. I'll
go ahead.
just sorry if I may, I just wanna say, like, I appreciate that, and, for me, it was maybe a product of just there aren't a lot of Jews on
Mm,
board, but I thought the entire thing was wonderful and a testament to who was on board, even if they weren't Jewish, they were curious and eager to participate with, you know, with an open-mindedness, that was wonderful. So in the end, um, that was really the takeaway, but thanks for, giving me credit.
well, and here's the thing, because 'cause you're talking about you've covered some huge ground, right? You've talked about seeing a globe without borders. You've talked about working with people from cross cultures, like on ships where you can't just leave and go your separate ways for a while. Like you're working together. Um, can you talk about what that diversity looks like? How does it come together? How is it a problem like Hegseth says, and we need to have this unity that almost looks more like conformity, or what does diversity look like in teamwork?
Well, you've nailed it. I mean, you're saying it already. I am so in favor of DEI programs in the military. I think they're wonderful in general. I think that the argument that has been made against diversity is one of unit cohesion, but I think unit cohesion has been used historically as a form of exclusion for like we've seen this forever in the military's history. So for a long time, they didn't want to integrate African Americans into the military, and they claimed that doing so would be a threat to unit cohesion. Well, guess what? In the end, they did integrate, and the unit was better for it. And then the same thing happened about having women join the military. They did the same thing with the LGBTQ community, and just over and over again, unit cohesion is often I think a way to mask what is often animus,
Mm.
or a closed-mindedness towards the other. And in reality, the only proof of concept I've ever seen is that when people who are different come together, even if they came in with preconceived notions, once they're together, that's the thing that can really challenge whatever your stereotype or bias was coming into it. That meeting someone who's different than you and and approaching them with compassionate curiosity and realizing, oh wait, you're actually not what the media suggested you would be, or what those leaders, their rhetoric suggested you might be. Um, One personal anecdote is when I got to flight school, one of my first friends in flight school had never met a gay person before,
Mm.
and I had never met someone who had never met a gay person before. I did, and I, identified as queer, and so I was one of his first queer friends, and now he's, an advocate for the LGBTQ community. Like, I think he's like, oh, well, I never met you guys. You seemed scary, like whatever, and that's my friend now. um, but like we're just coming from such completely different worlds, and so the issue, though, is that when you have leaders that are giving rhetoric that is so inflammatory, or talks about diversity as such a bad thing, or talks about specific groups in certain ways, it is people are impressionable. And so there are studies that show that one of the worst things that can happen to unit cohesion is to have people already be biased against the people who are coming into the unit. Whereas if instead you had a rhetoric of inclusivity, if you had strong
Yeah.
DEI language in the beginning, you're setting the table actually for people to approach those interactions with a greater open mindedness that then leads to more successful results. So it's kind of, it is very impressionable, and how we talk about it is important. So I think not only is Hegseth wrong, but unfortunately, he creates more of a risk of this self fulfilling prophecy that if, like when people say not with that attitude, it's like with his attitude, we are dooming ourselves to be less able to maximize all of the benefits that DEI can bring to a place. And then I'll just add that, as a former division officer who led divisions of sailors who came from everywhere, I mean, what I saw were people who came from all over, from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, like from rural Kansas to like, you know, Chicago to Puerto Rico, and they we're on a mission together, and we're working together, and we're laughing together, and succeeding together, and we're, like, it was just it's a beautiful thing when you see it happen. Um and yeah, all I have seen is beauty that comes out of people from different backgrounds coming together and working together. And it pains me to hear, like, to me, I'm like, to speak poorly about it, you must have been so afraid of it that you've never tried it. You haven't embraced the possibility, because it's actually, I think for the people who do, it's incredibly enriching.
Mhm. Well, thank you for that. And I want to kind of sit there for a little bit. You moved from the Navy into law in the civilian world because you're out in it. But can you talk about, the military is a world. You're on a Navy ship, you're in uniform, you speak a different jargon, you have a handbook that tells you how to live your life. So there is that. But are there similarities between civil society and the military in America? Culturally, like, what are some concerns that you saw in the military or some other patterns in the military that you are kind of worried about as you look, um, again, to the civilian world?
What are patterns in the military that I see in the civilian world? Is that
Yeah,
the
sort of.
question?
For example, like the religious rhetoric we just talked about, Hegseth just a second ago, but now as the rhetoric, some of this you don't see the same sort of
Mm,
chaplaincy that you got to experience.
mhm.
Um, some folks will look at that and say, "Oh, that's just confined. That's a military thing." I don't think so. Can you talk about what that looks like, seeing trends in the military and your fears or concerns in domestic civilian society?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think sometimes what's happening in the military is a precursor to whatever we're about to see in the world at large or the country at large. And sometimes the military is the one that's late to the game and is responding later to what's happening culturally in the U.S. and then is responding to that. So, for instance, like integration is a great example in terms of integrating Black soldiers in. I think, World War II is a time when this really is happening, and it's happening in the military out of necessity before it's happening in the United States. Like, we
Mm,
haven't hit the civil rights movement yet, but I think, in we're because of a necessity, an operational necessity, they're like, we need all the men we can get, and so we see integration happen in the military sooner. They lead the way. I think people come home from war and they have an experience of, wait a minute, I don't understand racism in the same way now because I just had this experience serving
mm,
alongside my fellow man, and I actually don't see him as anything other than my brother in arms. And so I think that's an example where people coming home from that war helped shift culturally where we were at with racism and race relations in this country, and that's a good thing. What's bad is, that it started because of a necessity of war, but, we see this proof of concept again. When people are working together for a mission, they realize they're not so different, and human's a human, and we're going to rely on each other and count on each other all the same. But on the flip side, in terms of the LGBTQ community, the military was late to that game. I think it was only after culturally the US had gotten to a place where I think it was far more normalized to see queer couples together, that then finally in 2011 Don't Ask, Don't Tell is repealed. But that was far more normal. Like, I would say, though homophobia still exists and is still a problem in terms of right now what our military leadership is saying about it, um, that was an example where I think the military kind of like waited for the country to get somewhere. And we see this in other areas too. I mean, like, for marijuana is getting legalized state by state, and the military is only now beginning to think, oh, could this be a good thing, like, for our troops, or should
Hmm.
we stop disqualifying people from joining the military because they've used marijuana? This is like in the last year. This is a new proposal of maybe weed offenses shouldn't be a thing that we disqualify someone who
Hmm.
is able-bodied and ready to serve and wants to serve their country. Let's not disqualify them for that. That's an example of the military, I think, finally catching up to where the country's at. So it
Yeah.
can go both ways. But in terms of like Hegseth rhetoric about religion, that is something that I am watching with horror, as
Mm.
he has kind of revolutionized these Pentagon prayer services. And I think, yes, if people are tuning in for the first time, they may think that this was normal military tradition, but what they're seeing is very indoctrinating language. Hegseth has been bringing in Doug Wilson, who is a pastor of a white Christian nationalist church, and and he himself is offering prayers at these prayer services that are incredibly violent in their language, and are calling basically for Armageddon, referring, there are reports that commanding officers are using language of like Trump being the anointed one. So I think what's scary is that I don't think we are hearing that language in the same way at large yet, though, Trump did post a picture of him as Jesus that he said was him as a doctor. But, like, I do think that we're seeing this Armageddon language is happening more so in the military right now. But I think what it means is, if in a place where everyone has taken an oath to defend the Constitution, if this establishment clause that would ordinarily make us say that there should be a separation of church and state, if we're seeing that happen in the military in this place that should be beholden to the Constitution, what does that mean for the rest of the country? And I think seeing threats to our Constitution occur in a place that theoretically should be holding that document sacred is a very suggestive of maybe what is to come, and what we're not far from as civilians, and realizing that we are not separate from the military, that is our leadership too. And whether or not we are active duty members, we are contributing taxpayers, and this is our country. They reflect us as well.
Absolutely. Well, and like you said, this blurring of church and state is very concerning because that's not our constitution. That was very much intended. You could argue that, the separation of church, not even that phrase. I know that that gets controversial, but having a secular government is American. Like, it's as
Yes.
American as apple pie. Like, and it's a different, we still cannot. I was trying to compare militaries and military chaplaincies, and you can't. There's nothing. Sweden is another secular society, and they don't have the same sort of cultural Christianity that the United States has. It's like they do, but the way we have it is so intense,
Yeah, there's a
and
reason they made it the First Amendment.
yeah,
They were like, this is the first thing we're going to put in the Bill of Rights. We really want to make sure.
hmm,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, talk about as you're seeing it now in as a lawyer. You worked like I mentioned earlier for the Truman National Security Project. Can you talk about some of your legal work, and what are concerns, red flags you're seeing?
Sure. So for a little bit of to clarify, I guess my timeline, I went to law school while I was active duty. When I was on short tour orders, I had relatives when I was deploying, what felt like a lot of free time because I was no longer on ship all the time, gone for
Mhm.
months out of the year. So I realized, okay, I've got some free time. A lot of my friends were the Navy was advising them this is a good time to have kids or get a master's degree. I didn't want to have kids at that time. And I thought if I was going to go back to school, really the degree I wanted was a law degree. So I took the LSAT and I found that University of San Diego had a part-time program. So I was taking classes at night and often going straight from the Navy in my flight suit to law school.
Wow.
Um, and in the end, I finished in 2.5 years and graduated law school while I was still active duty. And then instead of taking, so I haven't taken the bar because I was still active duty when I got out of law school, thought it might be crazy to study for the bar and be active duty. I don't have to do that, but I knew that I had figured out how to juggle the Navy with school.
Hmm.
So I rolled right into this Master of Laws program, which was started remotely at Columbia, but I was taking 5 a.m. classes on Zoom. And then as soon as class was over at 8 a.m., I'd go to work for the Navy, put my flight suit on. So in the end, I transitioned out of the Navy halfway in this Master of Laws program and graduated just a few months after. So I still haven't taken the bar because right away, then while I was still in this Master of Laws program, I took this job working for the Assembly. So that's been the timeline. So I haven't practiced law, but I have through 2022 until getting out of the Navy was studying the law deeply in my free time. And also, while I did that, I mean, I juggled a legal internship with the Legal Aid of San Diego. I was their pro bono intern over the summer. I was a pro bono clerk for the Children's Advocacy Institute at the University of San Diego School of Law, and a federal benefits consultant for them as well. All of this while I was
Wow.
active duty, just doing it in my free time because it felt so important. In the end, I graduated law school with a criminal litigation
Mm.
concentration, but really by the end of law school, I'd found my way to children's advocacy. And then my Master of Laws is in global business law, but that was an attempt to kind of bridge the gap between my foreign policy experience that I'd gained from the military with my legal background. But what I'll say really is that getting this crash course in the law made me realize the extent to which most people don't know much about the law. We in the military are swearing this oath to defend the Constitution. I don't know how well people know what the Constitution says, but certainly how many people have taken constitutional law as a semester doctrinal class in law school where you're reading all of the court cases that really get into what does the language of the Constitution mean and how do judges interpret these gray areas? And so, really, like the first flag is just that when we are talking about the fact that we hope troops disobey unlawful orders or that we hope that they uphold their oaths to the Constitution, we really need to acknowledge like that is a difficult thing for any American to know. Like most Americans probably don't really grasp the significance of every word and what they all mean, let alone the 18 to 25-year-olds that make up so much of our enlisted ranks too. Like the pressure to put on an 18-year-old to be able to tell what is constitutional or not in a moment and have to put on them that distinction, that
Right.
that it falls on them to make that distinction. That is a huge burden. And when you realize that, that's when I think it clocks how much of a problem it is that our highest leadership is blurring the Constitution or, outright like going against it, doing things that are clearly against the Constitution. That puts these junior sailors, junior soldiers in an impossible situation where they have taken an oath to defend the Constitution, but also to follow orders of the officers above them. And if the officers above them are giving mixed signals at best about what the language is and what that means and how to interpret it and what right and wrong is, that's a scary possibility for where we would be. And so that's the first flag. And then it's like, yeah, there are all of these flags happening of ways in which our leadership is doing things that are questionably constitutional, to include, you know, this war. Like, did the
Yeah.
president have the authority to do that? Does he have the power to continue it at this time? and like, so even that question, but also, the Caribbean boat strikes that were happening in the fall and continue actually to be ongoing, like, are those
Mhm.
acts of war? What are those falling under? These are questions we don't expect. We shouldn't expect the 18-year-old to be able to have the nuance of, which is why we really need to have oversight of these leaders who are
Mhm.
creating circumstances that are, yeah, putting junior enlisted and junior officers in, yeah, impossible situations.
Yeah. No, it is impo and it's such a good point too to put that pressure on them, because in a lot of ways, we know post Germany that just following orders is a like you that's that's not an excuse. Like, and so on that hand, but on the other hand, like the Nuremberg trials were for high ranking officers. Those were for people who knew and had discretion and had discernment and had intent and knew the handbook, the manuals, all the things. What we're talking about and what is the great misfortune, historically in militaries is that folks who are on the front lines are folks that are expendable to the state, unfortunately, and that are not the ones that they want to even have. Like, how do I want to say this? They don't want a lot of questioning. Is what I is. They don't want this idea of, oh, we're going to question. We're going to. There's no democracy when it comes to missions and or very little, and that's why we have to trust our leaders to act with responsibility, with temperance, with discretion. And right now, it seems very reckless, chaotic. The lead, even like the energy of it, just feels destabilizing.
Yes.
And the massive swings and changes that we've seen in leadership in the last year at the Pentagon level, which is really upsetting too, because he's claiming these are DI. To your point about DEI, he's claiming a lot of this is DEI. This is woke, but you know better. You know what the military looks like as a meritocracy. Can you talk about kind of how, like what you were saying earlier, that these comments about DEI are not just wrong, um, but you can't just get ahead because of certain things. Can you talk about what it looks like to have standards, to have points, and the different ways that folks rise through the ranks?
Sure. So how it used to look is not how it's looking right now. Though technically I think the handbooks probably look the same. We are not seeing it being, we're not seeing tradition, norms, customs, or the rules being applied the way they used to be. So it theoretically should be a meritocracy. There are benchmarks that exist. You're paid certain things for certain ranks at certain months that you've been in. You are looked at for promotion. There are ways to speed that process along here and there. There's like spot promotions that can happen, especially in the lower ranks of the enlisted. All of that is like doctrinal that exists. There's like the textbook rules for that. But we've already seen that they're statistically the percentage, let's just say, of women that come in at the earliest ranks dwindles by the time that you get to the higher ranks. So if it's 25%, these numbers are not exact, but something close to like 25% women in the enlisted ranks at the E1 to E3 level, the early enlisted
Mm.
ranks. But by the time you get to the E7 through E10, or like same thing certainly at the highest officer levels, that number tends to go to, I think, single digits. I think it's close to like 7%, 9%. Um, and so already there was lots of, like fair concern of why is that happening? Like that's could just be a retention issue. Maybe the women are just getting out because they don't want to stay in. They're having families. I don't know. But I think the reason, I mean, studies have shown that a lot of the reasons that women are getting out are like inherently sexist issues, whether it's childcare issues or sexual assault and sexual harassment claims, bad culture like that. These are the kinds of reasons that they claim are why they're getting out. But also, we know that representative leadership matters. So as long as you only have, 7% women at the top, when you're coming in and you don't see that pathway to success, that's another reason that you might get out. And you also maybe lack the mentorship that you need in the same way. We see similar drop offs in with minorities of all kinds within the military. That it as diverse as the military is at its lowest ranks, by the time you get to the upper ranks, it becomes basically white and male and often academy bred. So it's especially white men who went to the military academies are like at the top of the, admirals and generals. So for a long time, the military was trying to be self-aware about this, looking at these statistics and creating DEI programs to try to say, well, if it's a really a meritocracy, these numbers don't seem to add up. Like, how can it be that, the white men from the academies, are they really all just the best officers? Or is there something systemic that's the issue? And I think they, assumed there's got to be something that's wrong within the system. And they started attacking bias and different things. But now all of the DEI programming has been slashed. Like the first day that Hegseth became the Secretary of War, the first thing he did was dismantle all of the DEI programs. I remember the day my commanding officer comes in and goes, "So listen, guys, there's no more DEI programs. Don't worry. We still care about everyone just the same." And it's like, well, those are nice words, I suppose. But also, how can you care about everyone the same when the programs that are meant to find the holes and fill the holes of how people can fall through the holes. Um, when you've dismantled those programs, how are you looking out for everyone? So immediately that becomes a problem, and now you see the evidence of mass purging of like statistically, the statistics are showing Hegseth is firing women and people of color at a disproportionate rate, and often without any explanation of what they've done. And so I have written op-eds about this, but like I would argue that it's
Yeah.
either racial or sexist animus, or it's an assumption that people who look different or belong to these different identities, that it's an assumption that they're just going to be less loyal. I think we see a lot of things that show that this leadership is looking for pretty much blind loyalty. And like you said, yeah, you're for the people who are at the front lines, they don't want them questioning orders. So a lot of these people who are being fired without any obvious cause, did they challenge an order, or does Hegseth just think they're more likely to because of some potentially racist or sexist ideas? We don't know, but it's a problem that we don't know, that we don't know why these people are being fired. It's also a massive amount of people to be firing, especially in the middle of a war. That level of the disruption of leadership is a terrible thing to have. Like that, we shouldn't have that. You want people who are seasoned leaders in their roles holding those roles. Like he's firing the chief of staff of the army, but also the head of the chaplaincy, the head of training and indoctrination. Like, so there's those roles. And then it's also people who he relieved an admiral who we do know who was a black admiral, but also did have I think challenged the legality of the boat strikes in the Caribbean, and now he's gone. And so whether it's that they're challenging, whether it's just the optics, and actually there are so many statements collected that the president cares a lot about the aesthetics of the troops. He has said that he likes his people out of central casting and has refused to even be in photographs with uh, veterans with disabilities or active duty members of color. Like he's looking to pose next to GI Joes. So there's also just like that completely arbitrary, you know, their like machismo vision of what someone in the military should look like. So for all of these potential motives, what we're seeing is whatever meritocracy this was is only as good as if these top bosses like you and the way you look when you are on your way up. Otherwise, you are
Yeah.
unlikely to last long. And so I think what it's going to have is a chilling effect on speech. Like no, people are going to be less likely to want to challenge if they value their job and need the finances or want to stay in it, like the work. But it's also going to be probably incredibly hurtful to recruitment, incredibly hurtful on retention, and recruitment plus retention. That means readiness, and that's national security. Like DEI has direct impact on national security if we make this a more difficult place for anyone who's the least bit different to be. Doesn't matter what kind of meritocracy we are in name, we are going to lose talent on all,
Mhm.
and we will hemorrhage talent.
Yeah. And it's why like I have loved being able to go back through military history and see all the different voices and faces that made things happen for American military missions, battles, Um, Negotiations, we're talking like, I mean, we're it's inspiring on one hand, like, yes, it gives me, like, the quote unquote "feels," but it also, like, throws me into this very pragmatic, like, "No, this is how we get through things, is together," is, like, having different it's not even I don't wanna go into the I'm, like, frustrated with having to go into the public square and, like, defend and justify so many people's existence when there is so much evidence that without these people's existence, we would not have been able to do what we've done so far in the American military, and I'm not here to like, go down the rabbit hole of, like, conquest and American imperialism. I'm just talking about having a functioning military, securing borders, national security, those things. And again, those come from the efforts of all of us.
100%. Yeah, and I think that's part of what we're also seeing an effort to erase that history, because any of us who know the history or any of us who have experienced it ourselves, it's self-evident. But if they can remove all take off plaques, the contributions of women, the contributions of people of color, like, then it's harder to point to that evidence and say, look at no, look, we've done this before. And they want it seems like they want to avoid that conversation and remove yeah, they're hoping to hide the evidence. But yeah, this is again why I say, like, the more we can throw people together, the more we create these, it's a proof of concept every time. And we build the argument together how that it's successful, it's the proof of concept within itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and this will probably be the last big question, and then we'll wrap up. But
Cool.
can you talk about you mentioned earlier not putting being reasonable about our expectations of 18-year-old troops, not putting people in positions to make very weighty, heady decisions about what is constitutional in the heat of battle. Let's talk about kind of post-service, seeing a lot of things in the headlines too, particularly like Senator Mark Kelly and the where it's going with the Hegseth and where veterans are allowed to speak out politically or freedom of speech. Can you talk or explain to folks what is going on there and sort of your perspective on Senator Mark Kelly and Pete Hegseth?
Yeah, totally. Huge, huge, important issue. First of all, people who are active duty are giving up their freedom of speech voluntarily, in part when they take the oath. Being an active duty member means that you can't use your uniform when you're making partisan remarks. There are limits to what you can say, which is why veteran speech is so important. That once you're out of the military, now you get the opportunity to say more. You can be partisan if you want. You can speak out, like, and that is so valuable because you were honoring your commitment to that organization and not trying to ruffle feathers while you're in it to make that strong, keep it ideally secular, keep it nonpartisan, keep it neutral, as it should be. But then when you get out, yeah, go ahead, do whatever advocacy and activism you want. Now they're trying to argue that that's not the case, which already the premise is a horrible one. Like, that premise should be thrown out immediately. The idea that we would not want to hear from our veterans is just crazy to me. Like, I mean, we covered this already in this conversation. The voice of veterans is so important because they have a unique and intimate knowledge of war, of combat, of foreign policy, of all of these things, of the internal workings of the military. And so who better to advise us and offer perspective before we contemplate engaging in conflict abroad, but also how we should structure the military, how we should train people. Like, veterans can look back on their time and give us the best feedback. They should absolutely have a seat at the table. We should amplify and elevate their voices. So with that in mind, like, the idea that veterans should have less speech than civilians, that's crazy. I mean, veterans technically they are civilians again, so constitutionally they fall under that. But again, yeah, we should be doing our best to try to listen to them, and instead we're doing the opposite. So what we're seeing with Mark Kelly is, yeah, that he is being made. They're trying to make an example out of him, but a number of veteran lawmakers, in their capacity as veterans, made a video where all they did was simply restate what is the rule, which is that you should disobey an unlawful order. They stated the law, they recited it. And immediately the president fired off tweets where he accused them of treason and sedition and threatened that they should be hanged. And the idea that literally just reciting what the current laws of our country are, that is treachery, that's treacherous, that is an act of sedition worthy of hanging, even if he's joking, like, that it doesn't matter. For the president to suggest in any way and use his platform to suggest that, like, what patriotism is that? The recite like, it should be patriotic to recite our laws and our rules, like, if anything. It certainly shouldn't be an act of sedition. But by doing that, like, I think most courts have clearly said, like, they're on a war path, this is a witch hunt, and it's completely unfounded, and, like, what it like, the audacity of Pete Hegseth to do this is, I think, the general consensus. And yet it's an exhausting thing to go through the labor of these, they are, instead of having an army, instead of demonstrating this, like, coup, or this that we normally would see it, they have flanks instead of lawyers, and they are lawyering up and making it incredibly painful to speak. So even if they're unsuccessful in court, which they should be, because there's no legal justifiable, like, their case is based on nothing. Nevertheless, they're making it incredibly painful to do anything that to speak in any way that they don't like, which is, and what's amazing is that this isn't even a thing that the fact that they don't like what he said means they don't like him just reminding troops of the law. That's what's they are afraid of that. Like, they're really kind of showing their hand here by indicating that because they're willing to go out of their way to make it so painful to even say what the law is, that's how afraid they are of troops knowing that they have a duty to disobey unlawful orders, like, that feels threatening to them, that they would have loyalty at all in question by critical thinking that is in fact the rule.
Yeah.
So anyway, it could have a very, it could have a chilling effect on speech, certainly. Who wants to go through the legal battles of fighting an administration that is, clearly, they have an entire Department of Justice to do their bidding, to go after their enemies. So if you can get in trouble for simply stating a law, imagine how much trouble you can be in for saying the things I'm saying on a podcast like this. And, this is a senator. Mark Kelly was an astronaut. I mean, he is a fighter pilot, veteran, astronaut, senator, and they're coming after him. Like, you know, we're all toast. And so I think yeah, they're trying to set an example. And the worst thing that could happen is that it works. And so we do need to continue to speak out, and we have to really have the backs of people who are speaking out to make sure that they are supported and not alone. Because when someone's speaking out and they're the only voice, it's easier for them to be targeted. But if we're all, more united in our messaging, and just, if we're all reminding the troops, it's harder for them to single anyone out and make an example.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for sharing again your military insight and your legal insight, your advocacy insight throughout this episode. It has been, my goodness, so rich and with information. I really appreciate you. And I'm glad you're online. I'm glad you're here talking about this. Julie, can you tell folks where they can learn more from you, how to follow, where they can go?
Yes. Firstly, thank you so much for this
Oh,
conversation. Thanks for all you're doing. Yeah, if folks want to follow with me, I'm on Instagram, Jyrola, and I'm also on TikTok, which is just Jyrola for the number four U, the letter U. Um, and I think those are the main places to you can find everything else that I do there, but I'm a weekly contributor on the Fulcrum, so you can look for my column there. But if you follow me on Instagram or TikTok, you'll get I always link to those. So that's the best way.
right on. Well, that's very cool. I didn't know about the Fulcrum thing. I knew that you were contributing to publications. I didn't know you had a weekly column. That's really rad.
It's pretty new, but it's exciting. Yeah, I think there's a couple other places you might see me soon, but I don't want to jump the gun.
Right. Gotta wait till the ink is dry first,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
absolutely. Well, folks, thank you so much for listening today. Can y'all let me know in the comments what y'all thought about this episode? I really enjoyed it, and Julie, please come back because there were questions as we were talking. I was writing down that I was like, we're not going to cover this hour, but uh, I would. I just love your perspective on.
I would love to
Like I
be
said,
back anytime.
see, folks, there we go. Alrighty. Well, folks, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. You know the drill. My name is Lee. This has been another episode of Follow the Leader. Until next time, see ya.